Good evening. I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise based in the UK, but with people who have an interest in our work in 21 countries around the world. As a certified social enterprise, we have a formal mission statement up in Companies House. That is, and this is verbatim, to promote reform of the financial sector so it serves society better. That should give everybody a bit of a feel for what we're all about. We've been running for 10 years or so. During that time, we've managed to get three parliamentary inquiries opened, and there's a backbench debate that's been organised on the theme of hidden credit lines and the role of the Financial Conduct Authority. That backbench debate has been won by John McDonnell MP, who is the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on investment fraud and fairer financial services. I mention that in particular because my organisation, Transparency Task Force, provides the secretariat to the APPG on a completely pro bono basis. We really do believe in what that APPG is all about. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be hearing from John Plender. A little bit of information about John. You probably already know this, everybody, but I'll cover the ground anyway. John is, of course, a superb, high-profile Financial Times columnist. He's written for the FT since 81, before which he was a financial editor of The Economist. He's a winner of the Wincott Foundation Senior Prize for Excellence in Financial Journalism. Until the late 1990s, John combined his work for the FT with broadcasting roles at the BBC and Channel 4, and he's had a number of advisory positions, including membership of the World Bank OECD Private Sector Advisory Group on Corporate Governance. He has served on the steering group of the UK Company Law Review, which provided the basis of the Companies Act 2006. I'm sure the Companies Act is something we may well be talking about during the course of our session today. John Plender joined the board of Quintain plc as a non-exec director in 2002 and chaired the company from 2007 to 2009. He is currently a trustee of the £4 billion Pearson Pension Fund, and his latest book is Capitalism, Money, Morals and Markets, the book that we're going to be discussing this evening. So that's a little bit of information about John Plender for those of you that may not be that familiar with his work. John, we are very, very honoured, frankly, to have you with us. Ever so pleased that you're here to take time talking about the book you wrote some years ago and your more contemporary reflections on it. Before we pass the mic to John, so to speak, can I please invite everybody to show their appreciation for John's presence tonight and contributing to this conversation. John, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir. Talk for as long as you wish, and then I'll lightly facilitate the conversation after that. Thank you, John. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Andy, for that very kind introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to discuss this with you. Let me start by explaining that while my capitalism book first came out in 2015, why I think it's still entirely relevant in today's Trumpian, AI-obsessed and financialized world. This is because it identifies an underlying and enduring legitimacy problem in the way capitalism works. And it explores the reservations held about money and markets through history by philosophers, literary people, artists, historians, and religious divines, as well as economists, politicians, and business leaders. On the one hand, I argue that capitalism is brilliant. Through the process of industrialization and urbanization and the discovery of the miracle of productivity growth, that's the ability to increase the amount of output per worker, capitalism has transformed the world from being a place where there was little or no growth for per capita incomes over centuries to one in which millions have been lifted out of grinding poverty all around the world. But here's the great paradox. While capitalism is brilliant in raising living standards, many of us still feel ambivalent about the way capitalism does that job. Some of this relates to long-standing critiques, and just to give you a flavour of some of the leading ones, there's Marx and Engels, who worried about capital tyrannizing over labour and disrupting communities. You had in Germany Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright and poet, whose concern was around the materialistic preoccupation with utility and the dehumanizing nature of industrial production. Then in Britain, you had the art critic and social thinker John Ruskin, who provided an aesthetic and environmental critique. Ruskin highlighted the way capitalism had no inbuilt mechanism for addressing problems that require collective solutions, such as environmental degradation. Latterly, we've had the American economist Hyman Minsky pointing to the system's endemic financial instability, a point that resonates given the continuing shadow cast on the advanced economies by the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. And more recently, we've had the French economist Thomas Piketty focused on the problem of increasing inequality. Now, over time, we have learnt to tame many of the harsher features of capitalism. In the recession that followed the great financial crisis, for example, we didn't have soup queues. We didn't have homeless, unemployed workers living in shanty towns, as in the 1930s depression. And that's thanks to a substantial welfare safety net we now rely on. But underlying these discontents that I've outlined, I argue in my book, is something more fundamental. And that is a profound unease about the centrality of the money motive in driving economic growth within the capitalist system, or, in a word, greed. Now, this was most pithily expressed by John Maynard Keynes, who's said to have remarked, and I quote, "Capitalism is the astonishing belief that the nastiest motives of the nastiest of men somehow or other work for the best results in the best of all possible worlds." I would put it more prosaically by saying that to the extent that capitalism has an ethical basis, it amounts to utilitarianism, the greatest good of the greatest number. But that means that it is blind to moral nicety and indifferent to the plight of the disadvantaged in society, provided living standards are rising in aggregate. Now, there are countless examples I could quote to you to illustrate Keynes's point, but I'll offer just one, the robber barons of the American Gilded Age, the folk like Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick. Some of you may recall that when Frick was confronted with a strike at one of the main steel plants in his empire, he hired agents from Pinkerton to come in and break the strike, and they shot many of the strikers dead. Now, these robber barons were not nice people. In fact, they were seriously nasty. Yet they helped drive one of the fastest rates of economic growth in American history. And there could be no better illustration of the paradox at the heart of the capitalist system. Such capitalists succeeded in generating huge wealth while simultaneously bringing wealth creation into disrepute. Let's note in passing that Elon Musk and many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs fall within this tradition, although I'm not aware that they've shot anyone yet. I should emphasize that concern about the moral character of money goes back to antiquity. Plato, in his Laws, was very anti-business. Aristotle frowned on trade because he thought it undermined the civic commitment of Athenians. He also thought lending at interest pernicious and unnatural. This anti-business sentiment echoes down the ages in literature. You see it in the repulsive guests at Trimalchio's banquet in Petronius's Satyricon. In Moliere's Bourgeois Gentilhomme, Monsieur Jourdain, who delighted in discovering that he'd been spending a lifetime speaking prose. And you find it in the villains in the novels of Dickens, Balzac, Zola, Dostoevsky. But the bias against money and business started to erode in Europe from about the 12th century, when merchants in the Italian city-states infiltrated and displaced the landed aristocracy. For the first time in history, wealth ceased to be rooted in ownership of land. Then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, came an intellectual revolution, best exemplified by Adam Smith, who, in The Wealth of Nations, lauded the bourgeois virtues and the economic benefits of the pursuit of self interest. As you know, he famously argued that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Finally, there came the Industrial Revolution with its immense potential for productivity enhancement and thus for increasing living standards. But as the 19th century novelists understood so well, entrepreneurial capitalism was not always a pretty thing, and that very much remains the case in the 21st century, as we look, for example, at the behavior of bankers before and after the great financial crisis. They brilliantly disproved Dr. Johnson's adage that a man is never so innocently employed than when getting money. For bankers are now the Achilles heel, the potential saboteurs of the global economy. That was a central lesson of the great financial crisis. And that, as I explore in the book, is an important factor in the rising populism that is apparent among the American and European electorates. It reflects immense disillusionment with the political and business elites and with the globalized form of financially oriented capitalism that they have promoted. Will we ever succeed, you might ask, in making capitalism more stable and more respectable? Well, I have my doubts. Uh, the centrality of the money motive in the workings of capitalism means, in practice, that I think there will always be a legitimacy problem. Another reason for concern is that the monetary and regulatory response to the extreme gyrations of our capitalist economies has been problematic. US monetary policy around the crisis was asymmetric. That is, when markets crashed, the Federal Reserve came to the rescue. But when markets boomed, the Fed did nothing to cap asset prices. And that's morally hazardous and conducive to excessive debt financed risk taking. Post crisis monetary policy is operating on the same basis across the developed world. And I outline in the book how we've also become trapped in what is sometimes referred to as the deficit bias. It's now possible to impose fiscal discipline only on a bipartisan basis. And many of you will remember that quip of Jean Claude Juncker, who said, "We all know what we have to do, but we don't know how to get re elected when we've done it." And that sums up one of the major problems of political economy that we have at present. And that all this is against the background of unprecedented levels of peacetime debt. Um, and the demographic background is equally problematic because we have hard pensions and healthcare liabilities that are rising inexorably because of aging. On top of that, we have the geopolitical imperative. Everywhere defense spending has to rise, this contributes to an ever growing boom and bust dynamic from which it's impossible for governments and central banks to step down within that political economy bind that I described to you, the deficit bias. A big snag that I highlight in the book is that the risks in finance have escalated because of financial innovation, complexity, concentration, and continuing flawed incentive structures. Top management in the big banks really doesn't know what is going on. And these are the too big to fail banks. All the scandals over interest rates and currency market rigging, money laundering, mis-selling retail products, and the rest indicate that nobody is really fully in charge. At this point, let me turn to another question of legitimacy raised in the book, which relates to corporate governance. The central engine of capitalism is the limited liability company. And since its introduction in the mid 19th century, our mental model of capitalism in the Anglosphere has been based on shareholder primacy. Shareholders were seen as the residual risk takers in the capitalist system, and thus entitled to all the profits of the enterprise after the claims of creditors, employees, and the rest had been met. This made sense in the 19th century when capital was scarce and labor was plentiful. Much of the corporate sector was controlled by individualistic entrepreneurs who stood to lose hugely if their enterprise failed. But today, capital is not scarce. The role of the equity markets is less to raise new capital than to refinance companies that have become over indebted and to provide an exit for private equity investors. Ownership is dispersed across mainly institutional shareholders whose portfolios are highly diversified. They are much less at risk than employees, suppliers, and other stakeholders. In the knowledge economy, competitive advantage derives increasingly from human capital, so it's questionable whether shareholders should exercise all the control rights in the company. They are no longer residual risk takers. In this same current model of capitalism, corporate governance is marred by what I would consider flawed incentive structures. Bonuses and LTIPs offer very short-term rewards for performance measured by metrics such as earnings per share and the share price. These are readily manipulated and deliver bonus boosts. They provide a greater incentive to invest in share buybacks than plant and machinery, R&D, and other long-term projects. This really is very redolent to the financial engineering that characterized the great Japanese bubble of the 1980s, when financial engineering became more important than production. And I think this phenomenon of flawed incentives and the retreat into share buybacks is an important factor in Britain's poor productivity performance. Before I sign off on this introductory set of remarks, I should just mention some of the other topics around capitalism that I explore in the book, just so that you know a bit more of what it's about. Um, I look at the politics of the debtor-creditor relationship, which Keynes called the ultimate foundation of the capitalist system, at whether trade and economic interdependence are conducive to peace and stability, an idea that derived from enlightened thinkers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and to a degree Adam Smith, which I think has been shown to be fundamentally flawed in the latest economic cycle, particularly in relation to Russia and China. I look at the nature of entrepreneurship and the flawed belief that manufacturing is inherently more virtuous and productive than services, and likewise at the morality or otherwise of speculation. And finally, at whether the values of art and commerce are irreconcilable. The book concludes with a forecast that there will be another financial crisis, and it will be a big one, and that in today's fragmented political and economic world, it could be very messy. But in the post-Cold War world, there is no realistic alternative to capitalism. No one, after all, is going to look to North Korea as any kind of model. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the only question is where on the spectrum countries lie between relatively free market capitalism and authoritarian statist models. With Trump Mark II's increasingly interventionist approach to economic management, that spectrum has narrowed. I don't think we'll ever get away from capitalism's legitimacy problems, arising from all the turbulence, inequality, and externalities inherent in the system's creative destruction. But we must hang on, to me, it seems, to the fact that it still has the capacity to raise people out of poverty in a big way, and that it is always dangerous to underestimate human ingenuity and the human capacity for innovation. But my last word is that one's worry, particularly in the light of the AI revolution, is the capacity of that ingenuity and innovative capability to generate jobs in the way that it did in the past. Thank you.
John, thank you. That was a beautiful whistle-stop tour through some incredibly thought-provoking thoughts. We're very grateful to you, John, for sharing those. I'm going to, if I may, ask a few questions before we then invite Professor John Ashton, then Tom Schuller, then others to chip into the conversation. Um,
Yes.
you're the only person I know, John, who had any involvement whatsoever with the creation of the Companies Act. So it would be foolish of me to not ask you a question relating to that. The question is this: given what you now know and now think, what changes could be made to the Companies Act to encourage a more benevolent form of capitalism than what we have now?
Well, I think the thing that I should just say that I was a member of the steering group of the Company Law Review, which provided the blueprint for the 2006 Companies Act. And I think the thing that I feel most ambivalent about what we did and how it was translated into law relates to our definition of the director's duties. And we were asked very specifically when the review was set up, originally by Margaret Beckett, first of all, to produce a review which would command the support of both the employer organizations like the CBI and the TUC. And could we please settle a stakeholder issue for all time? Well, that's a pretty challenging remit. Um, and
Mm.
I think that our to take the central point, which is the director's duties and the stakeholder issue, I feel that our definition of the duties of directors was not satisfactory. In essence, it was a stakeholder definition because it said that the duty of directors was to pursue the success of the company in the long term while taking into account the interests of the various stakeholder groups. And in practice, the, uh, it's not been a strong enough formulation to prevent pressure from the capital markets and the discipline of the hostile takeover from trumping uh, those stakeholder considerations and putting short term shareholder primacy before the stakeholder interest. And I think it's quite difficult to do, and I'm not sure how best to do it. But I think we do need some strengthening of the director's duties definitions. But the problem we had in hindsight is that all the people who are disadvantaged by putting the short-term shareholder interest before the stakeholder interests do not have the resources to go to
Yeah.
law to back their complaint against the way the directors have ignored their statutory duties. So I think that some strengthening of that section of the Companies Act is needed, but it's quite a challenge to come up with a good definition that will be workable and on which people will be able to get legal redress.
Again, John, thank you very much indeed. My next question takes this conversation international. Are there any countries, John, that you believe have got, if you like, a more progressive, a more civilized version of the kind of capitalism that we have here in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think that uh, if you want a form of corporate governance that has worked historically for stakeholders and particularly employees, the German system has had some merit. The only thing is it's also had demerits. There are a lot of things that you can point to in the way the German system works that have actually put the interests of employees too far before those of the shareholders, and which have allowed companies to go down the tube because the ownership interest was unduly neglected. I think possibly if I wanted to point to somewhere where I think we can learn quite a lot from, it would be Sweden,
Uh,
where they try to bring stakeholder interests or do bring stakeholder interests onto the board. And it seems to me that the Swedish model of capitalism has shown itself to be very, very robust and successful in that they have relied on the competition in international markets for goods and services to apply a discipline to their corporate sector, which has worked extraordinarily well. But while at the same time ensuring that there is a workable social safety net in their society and that companies do take into account more than the narrow short-term shareholder discipline that we have. And they do have an advantage in that they tend to have in their big companies controlling stakeholders who are able to take a longer term view because they are not subject to a short term capital market discipline. And
mm.
it could be that we might be able to think more constructively, particularly now that we've got institutions who have built up very substantial percentage stakes in our companies. Of trying to have a more enlightened ownership discipline of a kind that emulates what the Swedes have.
Thank you. Isn't it amazing how frequently the Scandinavians come up as being the most progressive about this or the most progressive about that? John, thank you. My last question relates to a recent docu-series on Channel 4, which you may or may not have seen, John. It's called Dirty Business, And it's about the well, it's basically about the sewage problem that we're all very aware of, our rivers and our seas being polluted. And in particular, I think it's about how the Environment Agency has failed to do a good job sticking up for society. And that takes the conversation to a pretty topical issue, which is regulatory capture. M Many of us within the Transparency Task Force and many of the parliamentarians involved with the all-party parliamentary group we provide a secretariat for are of the view that unless you do something to protect regulators from regulatory capture, they will sooner or later end up becoming very influenced by the lobbying power of the industry they're regulating. And of course, the financial sector has tremendous lobbying power. In terms of your thoughts about capitalism and the morality or otherwise of it, any thoughts about what could be done to immunize our regulators from that possibility of capture? Any thoughts around that?
Well, this is a very interesting area, and I think it's quite striking that if you look at what's happened in areas like the water industry, it's almost symptomatic of what's gone wrong with our capitalism,
Agreed.
and that the privatization process that took place from the 1980s, in a way, was over sort of emphasizing the value of ownership and how a transfer of ownership could transform things, when actually it's the structure of industries and the pricing structures within industries that is really important. And that if you transfer ownership in the way that we did in the 80s and 90s, regulation becomes all important. And I take your point entirely about the difficulties of regulatory capture. And it is simply something where the politicians have to crack the whip more firmly. But there are fundamental problems, and I would say they're most acute in finance. And if you look at, for example, the United States, the fact is that you know the you look at the lobbying power of the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce. They have bought up Capitol Hill lock, stock, and barrel.
Right.
Capitol Hill is totally beholden to Wall Street, and I think that and, until you can find a way through those kind of funding problems, and it's incredibly difficult because it requires the right constellation of voting power on Capitol Hill or in Parliament or whatever it is. Over here, it's slightly different in the sense that I think our problem is partly an issue of funding, particularly in the Conservative Party, where the hedge funders and the city more generally do pour a lot of money into the political process. And I think there's also actually, particularly with Labour, a culture of deference towards finance, which is something that ought to be addressed. And it really
Interesting.
makes me very unhappy when I see once again a Labour government assuming that part of the way to generate growth is to deregulate the financial system. Deregulating the financial system, if you do it pro-cyclically, as is happening now, both here and in the United States, is a
Yes.
recipe for um, sort of escalating the dangers of the boom bust cycle, which I write about in my book. And I think that really the financial system has worked best and has accompanied the highest rates of economic growth in this country and in the US between the Depression and the early 70s, when the Bretton
Mm.
Woods system broke down. Because during that period, finance was made to operate more like a utility than an entrepreneurial business. And I think that's what you want from your finance sector. You want a more utility like thing that provides support to industry and commerce rather than becoming an engine of economic growth, which it's not well equipped to do.
This is fascinating. This really is fascinating and so timely. Some of you will know that we are running, allow me to rephrase that. Some of you will know that the APPG on investment fraud and fairer financial services is running a summit in Parliament on Monday. Alexandra, please do invite all our guests that may not have yet booked onto it to join us if they'd like to. We have about 150 people coming, chaired by John McDonnell MP, the chair of the APPG. And the theme for that event is protecting consumer protections for the sake of society and the city. And it's all about this very issue, the idea that if we allow deregulation to take place, it will lead to more unnecessary, keyword unnecessary consumer detriment. That will lead to more scandals, more reputational damage for the industry, people even less willing to trust institutions with their money. John, what you've been saying in this whole session is so relevant to the work we're involved with right now. I can see Nigel Keynes is itching to come in with a point. Let's go to Nigel Keynes before we then go to Professor John Ashton to share his thoughts and then to Mr. Tom Schuller. Nigel Keynes, please do share your thought. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. A question for John, really, more than a thought. Um, Bearing in mind your comments a few minutes ago about the current sort of direction of the Labour government with in relation to finance and banks and what have you, do you think we're experiencing and witnessing an international race to the bottom in terms of financial regulation?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we are to a degree, and I think that you know the banks are looking at the to unwind the Basel regime, for example,
Yeah.
and in every advanced economy, the politicians are being very heavily lobbied on the basis that the Americans are reducing the discipline of the Basel regime, and everybody else will be hugely disadvantaged if they don't follow. So I think that is the epicenter of what is, the competitive cross-border race over deregulation, and where a lot of damage can be done. But you also see it in with the stock exchanges around the developed world, the pressure from them for more relaxed listing standards and so on. There is indeed a lot of cross-border competitive pressure for a reduction in regulatory standards.
And
Thank you.
also, the banks are becoming very globalized themselves, aren't they? Which is blurring sort of national borders and the very basic nature of nation-based capitalism is becoming very sort of muddy in many respects, I think. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And I would also add to that that I think that we talk about banks, but bear in mind that one of the biggest developments since the great financial crisis has been the growth of the private markets and
Oh, yeah.
non-bank financial institutions. We are seeing a huge wave of regulatory arbitrage in which the non-bank financial sector has hugely increased. And is relatively dangerous. I mean, if you look, for example, at the collateral rules which prime brokers apply to their hedge fund clients, they are so lax. They're deeply worrying. And these non-bank financial institutions are often very price sensitive institutions. And a lot of funding of government debt is now on a very, very short-term basis financed substantially by these non-bank financial institutions. I think that government bond markets are now much more dangerous places than we have been used to, and are very vulnerable to shocks. And so there are all sorts of potential systemic problems arising from the regulatory arbitrage and the rise of the private markets.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel and John. Let's now go to Professor John Ashton, who we've really got to know quite well over the last 6 months. John, it's great to have you with us again. Please do share your thoughts, comments, reflections. Thanks, John.
Well, initially, John, that was fantastic. I really like that. Goodness me. And what a broad sweep. I should say, actually, just as an admission, when I was a younger man with a young family, I did pick up quite a bit of consultancy on the company law review. So thank you ever so much for that as well. Goodness me, I've warmed to you a lot over the time. Um, in terms of going through this, I was thinking there's two questions really, I suppose I had. But echoing some of your points, say when we were just talking about banking, then a lot of the university grant funding that exists in the UK, a lot of it used to be focused towards just curiosity-related research, but there's been a big change more to industry objectives, and so in terms of banking, a lot of it's now positioned on areas such as making prudential regulation more competitive, which is, I think, fits in with what you're saying, John. So I'd imagine there'll be a lot more academic work chasing that money and probably writing these neoliberal ideas at the moment as well. But anyhow, huge sweep. I was thinking two questions really. One, is the UK an outlier? You were talking about shareholder primacy, and there's wider issues, say, if the firm goes bust, who gets paid? Who gets paid the first? In the UK, the employees are fairly far down the list. If you look at a lot of other nations, employees get paid far more earlier on, say, if a firm went bust. And in terms of shareholder primacy, say, placing shareholders with that role that it has under UK law. This is different, I would argue, from a lot of countries. So in the US, most law is state law, and you get all sorts of stakeholder type ideas that fit through there. In other systems, as you were saying, like in Germany, you have completely different governance systems with dual boards and the like, where, say, for example, workers' rights are more embedded. But is the UK an outlier in terms of this wider governance structure? The other thing I was thinking, because this was such a wonderful philosophical, sweet, so few economics professors could do this. I'll say that, John. Hats off to you. But I was thinking, in terms of when I used to struggle to explain some of these things to students, why does one country do one thing? Why does one country do another? When you talk a lot about the laws are different, obviously, but it's this idea, I suppose, philosophically, is who does capitalism serve? Do we need to free it so it can enforce some discipline in the world? This to cite another long dead political economist, the Hayekian view, or should capitalism be serving society in some way? More of a Cal Polanyi perspective, I suppose. But that was wonderful, and thank you ever so much, John. That was thoroughly enjoyed that. I
Well,
wish I
thank
could
you
do
so
that
much
as
for
well.
thank you for those very kind words. Um, First of all, is the UK an outlier? I think it is to a degree. I mean, I have tended to think in the past about the Anglosphere and that these problems of very short-term shareholder primacy being sort of common to the Australians and the New Zealanders and the US. But actually, as you rightly say, there is a lot of federal law in the US, and now the uh, sorry, there's a lot of state law that governs company behavior in the US. And now the federal sort of oversight from bodies like the SEC is being diluted very substantially. So they're in a rather different position to us, although there's a pressure for softer behavior on our sort of financial conduct authorities and other regulators too. But having said that, I think that the short termism is relatively extreme here, and possibly we are, if not exactly an outlier, certainly we suffer from the disadvantages of a bad shareholder primacy model rather more than the other Anglo countries, I think. Um, and then you say, who should capitalism serve? And thinking about wider uh, events around the world. I think what there are so many different models of capitalism, and there's some areas where it would be desirable if capitalism were to be given rather freer rein, like, for example, China, where you have a huge state-owned sector which operates extremely inefficiently and in a model which is very deleterious to the rest of the world because it's designed to dump Chinese surplus industrial capacity on the rest of us, and we pay a very high price for that. You look at Japan. Japan is actually getting quite a bit of benefit from a more shareholder primacy model, which has been introduced both through legislation, but also by the response of American activist shareholders who've moved into the Japanese markets. And Japanese companies have traditionally been run in the interests of the managers and to a degree the employees and at the expense of shareholders. Well, that is now beginning to reverse quite substantially, but not in a way which is yet, I would argue, very damaging to the corporate sector. I think it's actually benefiting from a more capitalistic system. So I think different considerations apply to different economies. But in the end, I do think that we are in the kind of world where a form of capitalism which recognizes the importance of human capital within the system, recognizes the different governance requirements of the corporate sector in a knowledge economy, does call for a rather more stakeholder approach, but without abandoning all the shareholder type disciplines completely.
Wow, thank you. I'm just putting a note in the chat. I'm going to read it out. I'm just about to put in the chat. It's so clear that John Plender has a treasure chest of knowledge and insight. I'm getting a lot of out of this conversation. I hope you all are too. Great stuff, John Plender. Thank you so much. Let's now go to Tom
Andy.
Schuler. Tom Schuler, your comments, questions, thoughts, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I entirely echo what you and John Ashton have said about really brilliant sweep. First of all, declaration, I'm not an economist, so these are amateur type comments. Actually, John Plender won't remember this, but he and I go back over 40 years when I became
I do,
interested
Tom,
in.
and it's very good to see you again.
Oh, well,
Wow.
I'm pleased. Anyway, we're interested in pension funds, which I had an interest
Indeed.
in the
Yeah.
employee
Mhm.
participation in the management of pension funds, and I learnt a lot from John's earlier stuff. So I'm still learning, which is a very nice position to be in. I've got two basic questions, one of which actually echoes what John Ashton has said, but in a slightly different sense. It's about the outlier question. And are we an outlier in the role that finance plays in our overall
Brilliant
economy?
point.
I mean, we serve, it seems to me, the finance sector here is not a finance sector that serves the national economy. It serves global capitalism, and that's what mostly distinguishes us from possibly most other countries. And that has a very distorting effect. We could call it the finance curse, maybe, at least some people have. And
Mm.
it certainly has a distorting effect. John, you mentioned human capital in the way in which it attracts people into the finance sector. Just total anecdotal. I remember a lodger in my mother's house 30 years ago completing a PhD in physics. What did he put this to use to? Answer, he went into the city because any physics job offered only a quarter of what he was offered in the city. So it's the role within our economy that seems to me to be particularly distinctive because it's got this global role to a greater extent than most other comparable economies. That second question is really about you've referred to sort of shareholder economy. I'm really interested and still a bit actively involved with organizations that try and promote, if you like, shareholder capitalism through the role of, if you like, ethical investing. So, share action, which buys shares in companies and then attempts to nudge or push uh, companies into directions that a purely capitalist approach might not take. So, particularly on gender pay gap, which is something Andy's kindly put a note in a book I once wrote about the gender pay gap and why that's occurred, but also on other things, notably now on environmental aspects. So, how far do you hold out hope or have confidence in issues like that, movements like that, to promote a better balanced, more socially oriented form of capitalism? That would be my uh, quite apart from the regulatory aspects, what can we as citizens do and as possible, members of pension schemes still, which are vast institutional investors, can we push asset managers and institutional investors in a direction that might alter the profile as we have it at the moment? But again,
Well,
thanks also for a really interesting introduction.
well, thank you, Tom. And those are very interesting questions. If we take the the finance curse and the extent to which the UK is an outlier, and how far our financial system sort of serves the wider economy and how far it's serving the rest of the world better. Um, I think that we do pay a price for having such a large financial sector. I think, but it hasn't always been the case, because really what turned financial services into a big contributor to the UK economy originally was after a period of North Sea oil, which did so much damage to manufacturing. We had this move to liberalize finance, and in particular, the Bank of England and Sir David Walker, in his capacity as the industrial advisor to the Bank of England, thought we must get rid of a lot of the inhibitions in the domestic financial markets in order to attract international business and find growth to compensate for the damage that had been done to manufacturing as a result of the appreciation of the currency because of North Sea oil. Now, to a degree, that did work. There was a huge inflow of foreign banks into London, and the economy did benefit, and there was a lot of employment benefit and a lot of benefit in terms of tax revenue to the Treasury. So there was a definite period in which there was an advantage to this enormous increase in London's international financial role. The trouble is, I think you can get to a point where the size of the financial sector is such that it can become a disadvantage. And I'd draw your attention to a lot of work that was done by Stephen Cicchetti when he was a leading economist at the Bank for International Settlements. And they did a lot of very interesting work on how, when the size of the financial sector goes beyond a certain point, it becomes a drag on economic growth. And also, it becomes an engine of potential instability. So if you look up Cicchetti, Stephen Cicchetti, and the Bank for International Settlements, I think the big paper he wrote on this might have been in 2013. But anyway, that's well worth exploring because it will give you quite a lot of the answer to your question. I think on the your other point about sort of ethical investing, shareholder activism, and all these things, um, there's a great sort of we had a very good period in terms of seeing particularly the American state pension funds like CalPERS and Wisconsin and New York State and so on, doing some quite good things in terms of applying pressure for better corporate governance. We've seen some quite good encouragements, even within UK pensions legislation, to get pension trustees to think more broadly about issues like, for example, decarbonisation and so forth. The trouble is there's a huge political tide against that now. And while it's primarily sort of a big tide in the US, it's beginning to affect the Europeans quite a bit. And you see it particularly with the big oil companies like BP retreating from their earlier commitments on global warming. But my feeling is that it's a long game. And I think there is a, still a growing awareness among British pension funds that there are things that they ought to do. And while the great majority of British pension funds delegate their fund management and their stewardship role to outside fund managers, I think they do in both setting the mandates for those fund managers and also in grilling them on their performance, talk a lot more now about stewardship than they did, say, 10 years ago. So I think that the thing hasn't been killed by this political wave from the States. I think there still is some impetus there. But I find it really distressing that the good work that has been done by people like you and a number of pioneering pension funds, especially in the States, on global warming and decarbonisation, it's sad that that's going down because there's no question that global warming is one of the biggest challenges to all of us and the planet, and it's very unfortunate that the tide is running against what is an overwhelming global priority. So, but anyway, I'm not completely pessimistic. I think there still is some impetus there, and I think we all should be trying to raise our game as pension fund trustees and fund managers on all that.
Thanks very
Tom,
much.
thank you.
Andy, could I just ask one very brief third
Of
question?
course, Tom,
So
of
is
course.
cryptocurrency just a giant Ponzi scheme?
Well, I think some cryptocurrencies, notably those like Bitcoin, are purely speculative. They are hot air, and they are faith-based assets. And if the faith evaporates, they're gone. But if you're talking about stable coins, which are backed by um, mainly US Treasury securities and things like that, and if you're thinking about what stable coins and what crypto might do to improve the efficiency of the payment systems around the world. I don't think it's a bundle of nonsense, but I think there's a huge regulatory and governance problem because there's
Yes.
nothing to ensure that the commitments of stablecoin managers to back their stable coins 100% with good assets. We've seen a number of cases where they've turned out not to have been doing what they said they were doing. So there is a huge problem there. But I do think that there is nonetheless some scope for useful applications of crypto, especially in the payments area.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, John. You really are revealing such a breadth and depth of knowledge, John Plender. Thank you. We're going to go to Mr. Martin White. We'll then try to squeeze perhaps one or two other quick points in, then we'll wrap up more or less on time at 7 p.m. Mr. Martin White, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, John. Nice to hear from you again.
Yes, good to
There have
hear
been,
from you, Martin.
yes, so many points that arise. I could take half an hour, but what I will do is, and I'll put some things in the chat, particularly about issues around UK levels of savings and Mervyn King's big concern that we're the lowest saver in the G20 and we're losing assets, etc., etc. But the thing I wanted to talk about was the really related point that's come up most recently in the conversation, which is to do with pensions and governance. Now, I'm currently engaged in a very vague thought experiment. What if our new forms of pension, which perhaps might be these collective defined contribution pension, are taken over and run in the interests of the members by the trade unions and non-corrupt trade unions who are not looking to make money out of it? That would then place them in a position of owning companies where they would want them to be run in the long-term interest so they're able to compete in the world and pay long-term dividends, but also to treat their workers properly. So they'd have to sort of grow up and face both sides at once. What do you think of that?
Well, I think this is quite difficult because one of the problems that bedevils the financial and saving system within capitalism is that there is this tension between capital and labor. And the question is, how do you resolve the tension? And it's quite hard to hand over the task of running large collective pension schemes to controlling trades unions without them inevitably wishing to place the interests of labor before that of capital. And what's required is a balance. And so I think things would have to be structured very, very carefully and unusually to ensure that there wasn't an unbalanced approach to all the governance issues within those collective pension vehicles. So I would want to know a lot more detail about what you're envisaging
Well, it
before.
might be fun to have an offline discussion. I've been very taken by the work of a Marxist economist called Anwar Sheikh, and he has done a major study into capitalism, and his conclusion is that if you want to get, if you like, economic growth in the ultimate interest of all of society, including productivity for workers, you have to accept that there's got to be money up front used to invest. So investment comes first, and then the whole society benefits. Lots of issues. I mean, but thank you. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much. Right.
Thanks, Martin. It has been brilliant. Would anybody else like to squeeze in a quick comment or question before I bring tonight's conversation to a close? In which case, I can't see any hands. In which case, I'm going to go back to John for his final comments in just a moment. But before I do, we're always keen to try to find some kind of action point to do something that might be useful in relation to the particular matter that we've been discussing. And I'm going to share my screen to draw all of your attention to some work being done by Martin Wrigley MP. You'll see why in a moment. So Martin Wrigley MP is a Lib Dem, not that we are in any way party politically aligned. We genuinely aren't. But he's been doing some work trying to revisit aspects of the company directors, sorry, the Companies Act, looking particularly at the company directors' duties. And as you'll see on this page, I should be sharing my screen now. As you'll see, it's the Company Directors Duties Bill, which hasn't got anywhere yet, really, but it has potential to in due course. And the long title is A Bill to Amend Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006, the very act that John Plender was speaking about earlier, to require company directors to balance their duty to promote the success of the company with duties in respect of the environment and the company's employees. It's obviously, it wouldn't possibly be some kind of a silver bullet, but it is the right kind of step in the right kind of direction, I would suggest. And it's just an idea. If you want to, Martin Wrigley's email address. I had the pleasure of speaking to him about this a couple of weeks ago. He's a lovely man, actually. His email address is publicly available. If you click on the link I just clicked on, you get to it here. So I'll put a link to his email address page and also that duties bill in the chat. And if you want to, perhaps pop him an email, an encouraging comment or any related ideas. Just let him know that there are people out there who, like he does, believe that there is, worthwhile scope for reform. That would be my suggested action, folks, if you want to do that. You never know. It might be the kind of legislation that actually does take hold. And even if it doesn't take hold, the very fact that these kind of progressive ideas are discussed in Parliament, that in and of itself is very, very important. I make that particular point knowing that the summit that I referred to in Parliament on Monday is all about the idea of stimulating adult conversation, grown-up, candid conversation about what needs to happen to reform the workings of our financial regulatory framework, which many of us believe needs to be done. John Plender, it's been great. Thank you, John. Back to you for your final comments, then we'll formally wrap up the session. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Well, I think what I'd like to do is, first of all, I feel we haven't talked quite enough about productivity, AI, and all those kind of issues, and our ability to generate jobs in an equitable way. And so I thought I'd do something slightly unorthodox, which is quote to you from my book, from a wonderful short statement by James Mead, great economist, which he made in 20, I think it was. Hold on, let me see if I can remember, 1964. And it perfectly describes the situation we are now in with big tech and AI. So let me just read this very brief thing. He said in a book in 1964, what the future might look like. There would be a limited number of exceedingly wealthy property owners. The proportion of the working population required to man the extremely profitable automated industries would be small. Wage rates would thus be depressed. There would have to be a large expansion of the production of the labor-intensive goods and services which were in high demand by the few multi-millionaires. We would be back to a super world of an immiserized proletariat of butlers, footmen, kitchen maids, and other hangers-on. Let us call this the brave new capitalist paradise. And he said to me, that's a hideous outlook. Well, I think that chimes. If you substitute care workers and NHS workers for butlers and so forth, he had an extraordinary vision of where we seem to be heading and is raising a terribly important set of points about how we generate employment and what we do about inequality. I think that's worth pondering on in your bath.
Or shower, or whatever your preference happens to be. That really has been wonderful. I mean that most sincerely. I sound like Huey Green. Do you remember Huey Green, folks? I mean this most sincerely. But that was great. I feel like I've been educated, good and proper. Tom Schuller's put a really good idea in the chat, John. He says, how about a follow-up session? There's much more to discuss. Mr. John Plender, if we found a way of asking you really politely, would you be happy to come back again?
Yes, given constraints in the diary, but it's certainly open to the thought. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll perhaps do something in 6, 9, 12 months. It would be very nice to have you back again. Can we once again show our appreciation to Mr. John Plender? Thanks, John. Thank you very much indeed. Super stuff. Super
Thank you
stuff.
all.
Thank you very much. Good evening.